Hello again, everybody, and thank you for joining me in your awesome outfit. I love it. Also, big credit to our previous panel and also to Sarah, who wins the moderation challenge today. Well done for getting back that 45 seconds. Because I can see we're already behind on ours. We are going to tackle it all today. Like, we are going to get through perimenopause and menopause myth busting, and there is a lot out there, but take a breath. So firstly, I want to say, you said this, and it seems obvious to me, and I hope I've got this correct. Women live on average 30 to 40 years post-menopause. This is something I just don't think we discuss enough, because we talk so much about that destination and not so much about what is coming afterwards. That's the thing that I found really striking in our initial conversation in the lead up to this event. The other thing I found striking, which is where I'm going to start in terms of questions, is that when you went through your career background and you've done a lot of different things, from gynecology, GP, I believe, working in addictions at one point, and you got to saying that some of the things that you learnt in aged care were some of the most profound things that you learnt. Could we start there? Because I think that will just sort of explain and it will lead us gently back into this topic.
Thank you for having me and come and speak. And I'm so glad so many of you are still here to listen, because I think it's been quite interesting seeing what's been going on this afternoon, talking about misdiagnosis and Cassandra's about dementia and all these blind spots that we have. So I'm going to try and pin that in together, especially following on to ADHD as well. I think when we have, so I went to medical school 24 years ago, and I've been working in the health space for 24 years. And 18 years as a doctor, and I did lots of obstetrics gynecology, which is all about reproductive health, getting women, looking after them from contraception from in their teenage years to they're getting pregnant, then doing the obstetric care and then antenatal care. And then normally what happens is that that's all we think about. That's all we're trained for, reproductive care. But in a woman's reproductive lifespan starts at puberty and ends at menopause. But where the reason why menopause matters is we're living longer. So the average life expectancy of a woman in Australia is 83.4. And the challenge there, going back to aged care, is that a lot of the time women are in ill health for longer, and they spend a good 2-3 decades post-menopause. Half of that is spent in aged care facilities. And it was interesting because in my early years, I would see these women, generally speaking, before menopause, women do not get sick. They generally have lower rates of heart disease, lower rates of all diseases overall when compared to men. That's why men generally are studied more, because our hormones generally keep the brain, heart, and bones ticking. And what happens is that at menopause, when the hormones are declining, it's a multi-organ decline, because estrogen is very important in terms of key messaging for them working. So we see a biological shift with accelerated aging and an increase in chronic disease. And going back to aged care, is one of the things I used to do is sit in a car on the weekend and evenings and go around and visit elderly patients who obviously can't get themselves to the hospital. And the commonest thing you'll see in women is that they'll be found fallen on the floor and confused, or we'll call it delirium. Most of the time they'll have a urinary tract infection, which is preventable from vaginal estrogen. And they'll get septic and get really sick, and a quarter of them go on to get sick and die. It's fatal, essentially, urosepsis in women. They break their hip because they have osteoporosis. So both of these things start at menopause. Okay, we know the decline in estrogen changes the microflora. There's a change in pH, change in your bacteria that's there. You're likely to get more recurrent bladder infections, which again, if we recognize that gave them vaginal estrogen, these women who obviously deteriorate in age and get urinary tract infections won't get them. But on top of that, we don't acknowledge this risk of osteoporosis. So osteoporosis is brittle bone. There's no symptoms. You don't wake up with painful hips. You generally essentially have a low impact fall. So you trip and you break your hip. And essentially you need a hip replacement. And we know at least 40% of them within the first 12 months will die, because for you to be so frail that you've got up from a chair, what typically happens is there's lots of frailty as we get older, because we don't build strength. We lose 0.6% of muscle per year from our 40s and onwards. So most women, as we get older, now don't only have issues with osteoporosis, vaginal dryness, and the changes in bacteria making us more prone to UTIs, but we're very frail. We have no glute strength. So when you're getting up, they'll fall. So the fundamental issue is that we don't really identify on how we support women as they age. So going back to my long-winded answer of when you're putting it together, if you look at it, most women, it's the reproductive hormones that play a role in not just reproductive lifespan, but also the 30, 40 years that they're living after in the absence of these hormones. They predispose them to chronic diseases, but also ill health.
Okay. You said we're going to have some fun up here, so we need to get to that because you also made the comment that menopause can be a destination and perimenopause is a journey there. And I think this is where it all comes in because we're talking about longevity and there is a lot that we can do to support ourselves for when we get up from the chair that we can be doing much earlier in life. And indeed, I imagine that you can be doing much later in life as well. But there's things that can be done in acknowledging these hormonal shifts and also supporting ourselves and looking after ourselves during those periods too. And beyond.
Exactly. So when I normally do a talk, and the slides aren't here, which is a lot easier. So why does menopause matter? Menopause is by definition cessation of your menstruation for 12 months. It's just that's what it means. And it's a reproductive definition. It's around your menses. But we don't really acknowledge what the biological shifts are, which we've explained lead to chronic disease. And I think it's because there's a lack of education. We've talked about allocation of funds in research. It's all about women under 50 and suddenly they become invisible. And so when I'm looking after women, I only do perimenopause and menopause. So going back to Angela's reference, I say menopause is a destination. You have a reproductive lifespan that starts at puberty, then you have pregnancy, postpartum, and somehow we don't educate anyone, including healthcare professionals, on perimenopause and menopause. Now, menopause is the destination. So you go from a monthly cycle. You don't just suddenly go into menopause one day, which is what everyone thinks, because they think they're never going to experience any of this. So that might happen on average 51.4. And then in your 40s, late 30s, you see a shift, and it's a transition with hormones declining. There's a hierarchy of hormones declining, progesterone followed by estrogen and testosterone in the background. And these all have really important roles in your mood, your cognition, your metabolism, your ability to cope and be resilient to stress and also sleep. And then there's also impact on each organ, your heart, your brain, your bone, and your metabolism. So I think first of all, we need to acknowledge that these hormones are really important and they're not just to make a baby, which is what everyone thinks. They're really important. And once we acknowledge that, then we need to think about, okay, well, hormones are the most important thing when it comes to longevity, along with your fundamental pillars of health, such as building strength, eating a whole food nutrition, trying to have social connection, because isolation is one of the biggest things of getting disease, illness, but also that makes you age quicker. And then obviously sleep is a priority as well, especially for women, because there's a lot of data around preventing Alzheimer's and with connection with not getting enough sleep. And in terms of longevity, I think all the longevity data is based on men, and it's biohacking and it's dipping in icy baths, which again does not help women because women's nervous system is wired completely differently. So I think I look after women mainly 45, 40 over, and the best cohort of women are the women over 50, 55. They're leading their best lives, and no one really understands it because there's so much fear-mongering around this. The problem is the algorithm will just show you the 50 symptoms, but they don't give you the solutions. And I think it's a bit like if I shared every single negative thing about pregnancy, no one would get pregnant. Therefore, no one really tells you about the nausea, all the complications of it. So with every natural transition, there's going to be issues, but it's because we don't have the right education and tools, and there's so much misinformation now. And so I think it's understanding what are the symptoms, why are they happening? They're natural. There's lots of things you can do with it. And how do we support our bodies through the transition, but also long-term to age? Because we need to match our health span, which is how long do we live in a healthy state, with our lifespan. So there's no point living till 95 where we're spending 20 years in an aged care facility with dementia or disability from a chronic disease or hip fracture. So I think we need to have that bigger conversation, but it's focused around menopause, which is great, but longevity is a huge part of the conversation, but it starts with preserving women's brain. So going back to Cassandra's research on dementia, that in research allocation is invisible for women over 50. Well, hang on, guess what? Most women, the biggest cause for death for women is dementia. And so breast cancer risk, death from breast cancer has actually gone down significantly. Even women with breast cancer will eventually die from the leading cause of death, which is dementia, followed by heart disease. Until 2016, heart disease was the leading cause of death for women in Australia, and the leading cause of disability is an osteoporotic hip fracture. So we need to actually talk about these things because we're spending about 30, 40 years. Most women in this room will stay until 100. Will they stay in good health? That's a different question. And the whole point is we need to have these conversations to support, because a lot of women will come to me and say, oh, we're just aging and this is part of aging. Well, actually not, it isn't. So we can do something about it. And I think it just starts from being educated, knowledgeable, and I can almost say 99% of my patients over 50 are having the best careers. They're starting new projects, new relationships. And so I think there's nothing to fear with the right support and the opportunity to have an open mindset. Most women thrive over 50.
I think we've got some agreement. I've certainly heard that as well. And so it's something that I am looking forward to. On perimenopause, when we talk about, when you say a journey, is it everything that's happened before perimenopause as well? Is that the journey that we talk about in terms of getting to the destination?
So the destination is no periods for 12 months, which is on average 51. Of course, it varies. But it's all to do with the end of your ovarian reserve. So puberty starts with you shedding an egg every month, and then menopause is essentially there's no more eggs, which means there's no more menstruation. Now, we don't just go from a monthly cycle in our 20s and 30s and suddenly nothing for 12 months. What happens, there's a threshold that we reach around 37, the egg count significantly drops, and you'll get typically told fertility drops over the age of 35. When I was training 25 years ago, literally if you saw a woman get pregnant at 35, you would be like, oh my God, this is what happens when you put career first, because it was unheard of. Women were told they have to get pregnant under the age of 30 because IVF wasn't widely available. So I think what happens now is the hormones start declining and there's a shift in your late 30s, early 40s, and slowly there's a hierarchy of decline with progesterone falling first. And progesterone is your hormone that you produce every month mid-cycle for ovulation to prepare the lining for implantation of the embryo and get pregnant. Now, of course, fertility is going down, so we don't produce as much progesterone. But progesterone is very important for bleeding control. So the first sign we see is heavy menstrual bleeding, which then leads to iron deficiency anemia. There's a huge gap. A lot of women are sitting with very deficient iron levels, which means they feel dizzy, they feel fatigued, they feel exhausted. And then couple that, when you lose your natural progesterone, it's an endogenous buffer for stress. It makes us sleepy, it keeps us calm. So now on top of that, you're not sleeping and you're anxious in an environment where you're a caregiver for elderly parents, young children, working full-time, and doing the invisible load of housekeeping and house chores and everything else. So now you're tipping over. So the early perimenopausal side present with mental health symptoms.
Yep.
They will never present with hot flushes, night sweats, because you need to have very low estrogen levels for that, or fluctuating levels for that.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to be aware of these transitions, late 30 to early 40s, and what we can do to support them. And with time, because you're going to have to ride this roller coaster of hormones that is a decade-long transition. And I think what we enter it depleted physically and emotionally. And that's probably because there's been a shift, or we're having kids much later. So 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, if you had your children mid-20s, by 30 you've had all your children, you kind of have kids that are going to university or school going, you're not worried, but that's not the case now. So most women are having IVF twins, they're entering in perimenopause, already sleep deprived, working full-time, exhausted, caregiving for an elderly parent who may have Alzheimer's, and also maintaining this career, and they should do because they've spent 2 decades building it, unaware of this reproductive transition and how to support them. So I think we need to start by educating women so they understand, because you have to advocate for yourself, because currently this is not taught in the medical curriculum. And so if you don't know what's happening with your body, I mean, you can find doctors who do, but a lot of doctors, they don't get taught about perimenopause. It's all about menopause, which again is easy to diagnose because you have 12 months of no periods. I mean, anyone can do that. It's a retrospective diagnosis, and you typically get, you don't even need to see a doctor. You already know you're in menopause. So save yourself that visit. Only visit if you need some help for it. And the perimenopause, I normally say, the cardinal symptoms are change in menstrual cycle, which again doesn't help women because majority of women now have a Mirena or would have had a hysterectomy. So again, if you're noticing a shift in your mental health, stress, ability to be resilient to stress, listen, you've been doing this for 20 years. If you're finding doing the same things you were able to do 5 years ago, you can't do now, you have to ask yourself in your late 30s, early 40s, okay, I think I'm going through that early change of perimenopause. I may need a little bit of help. And then with time, we add other things in and top up. Looking at your mental health, we've talked about mood. A lot of women who have a cycle will notice premenstrual changes where they'll notice changes in their mood. So irritability, they might notice severe anger.
I can see the ADHD panel nodding. I was also diagnosed as a child with ADHD, and I can tell you, it is a thing, right? It is a huge difference.
And we see ADHD, I did a whole series on ADHD unmasking, but we know there's a big overlap of ADHD and PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric disorder, a severe form of premenstrual symptoms. So the functionality gets affected. You may not be able to work, but may be able to attend those executive meetings at work. And I think it's recognizing that these hormones have a really important role in cognition. So cognition, I mean memory, task allocation, the ability to have the executive function of prioritizing, and also the fogginess, the focus and concentration. And so we notice that if you're menstruating in that perimenopause, you'll still be menstruating, it might be changing, but those symptoms get worse in that luteal phase just before your period. And so it was supporting women through this 10-year transition in their mental health and cognition, but it's the women who have to track their cycle, see what's going on. There's lots of cycles. If you don't have a cycle, then you just gotta have to track the symptoms and then be prepared and seek help, because we know 50% of these women in their early 40s get given an antidepressant. Now, of course, that's gonna help with your life stresses, but it's not gonna help with your perimenopause and your cognition.
Yeah. I can see we're running out of time. So a few things on the myths. You talk about this decade, and in my head I'm thinking perimenopause is average 7 years. Have I got that as... And there's no point that it necessarily starts, because we're talking about a slight decline that will continue until, obviously, the cessation of your period for 12 months, right? So, but it's not necessarily just a few years. This is a decade of your life that is quite transformative and significant. I'm going to stick to that decade in the 1 minute that we have left, / it has gone. So in that, what would you focus on as a woman in that decade then?
I think the problem is, as I said, you're entering already emotionally, physically depleted. Most women undernourish themselves. They're living on coffee and just quick little bites. Yeah. They're not exercising. They're not prioritizing self-care. And that goes to the fundamental pillars of feeding yourself food, not to be skinny or calorie restricting. You need to have whole foods with protein, fiber, and good fats. You need to exercise, but not do the cardio running, because that's losing muscle. You need to build muscle 30 minutes, 3 to 4 times a week. You need to manage, I didn't say reduce stress. Manage stress means 3 things. Stop people pleasing, stop overcommitting, know your value, and know your worth. And then that means you eliminate half of the stresses, because we've been conditioned to say yes. Yeah. And so all these things are depleting you. And if you're already doing those, what happens is those women's perimenopause transitions are a lot shorter. They'll find that their journey is only about 3 years before they end their period, because they've got the fundamentals in place where they're looking after themselves. And those are the women don't necessarily suffer for the whole decade, because they realize that they need to prioritize themselves and put their oxygen mask on before they can look after everyone else.
Wow. Okay. Well, we could go for so much longer, but thank you so much. Will you be sticking around a little bit?
Yeah.
I'm sure people might have some more questions. So thank you.